from the piano up with it and got it for you. Okay, so you can have another one if you like. Because I will be referring to this as well. That will give you kind of a very simple, I say very simple, a simpler background to things, and I'll mention that as we go. Okay, let's get into the first session then. So what we're looking at this morning is the subject of the oldest and best manuscripts. If you pick up a modern Bible, you'll frequently find a footnote that says, in fact, shall I just record this? You'll frequently find a footnote that says the oldest and best manuscripts say. And the reason I felt it was important to do this is because when people do theology at university, they're taught all this stuff that we're going to look at this morning. So the aim in the first session is to debunk the modern claim that modern Bibles are translated from more reliable documents than was the King James Bible, because they say the more reliable documents are the oldest and the best. Just before we get into the nitty-gritty of the presentation, probably wise to say a word or two about my personal qualifications for conducting the seminar at all. We're hoping to get this on the internet. If it goes on the internet, this is the first question that some people will ask. And maybe somebody today, or as I say, living on the internet, whose first and most important consideration will be, what university did Mr. Tyler go to? Or what Bible college did he go to? And I just want to say three things quickly to that, in answer to that first of all. For those who believe in modern Bibles, whatever intellectual or academic credentials I may have will never, I have found in many cases, be sufficient. Jack Moorman, many of you know, was with us last year, and Jack's got a brain like a planet. You sit and talk to Jack, and if you're not careful, he'll leave you for dead in 2 minutes flat. And you know, if he gets on an interesting subject. And his books are evidently the result of a very wide reading of the relevant materials, and his knowledge of the subject is considerable. And yet there's a site on the internet that's not satisfied with Jack Moorman's doctorate. They still say that he's not a scholar. So whatever university or college to which I may or may not have been would never be adequate for some of our critics. Which leads to my second point. Frequently it appears to me that our academic qualifications are more important to our critics than any facts we might produce. They cannot hear what we say for the thunder, what they consider to be the thunder of our ignorance. 17th century preacher John Trapp once wrote, quote, "A mortified man will yield to learn of anybody," unquote. And I'm going to be leaning a lot today on John Bergen, and I shall tell you much more about John Bergen. He wrote, among other things, a powerful defence of the last 12 verses of Mark's Gospel, and was simply ignored. For people who like facts and argument and not hot air from conceited windbags, Bergen's works are a sheer delight. And in Luke's Gospel, chapter 20 and verse 2, we read of the chief priests and scribes coming to Jesus and saying, "Tell us, by what authority doest thou these things? Or who gave thee this authority?" Can you all see and read that okay? I hope you can, because there's nothing I can do about it. You can all read that, yeah? Good. Yeah. So the scribes come, the chief priests and scribes come to Jesus and they say, "Tell us, by what authority doest thou these things? Or who gave thee this authority?" And these are typical of religious leaders today who do not recognise the voice of the Holy Ghost or of the Holy Scriptures. They always want to know what our authority is. Jesus gave them no answer, and neither will I. Thirdly, most of God's saints are neither called to university or Bible college. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, quote, "For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise." If a man with a university education does not know how to keep things simple, he's not fit to teach. And if he expects ordinary saints to be able to read Greek and Hebrew, or maybe Codex Being and its Allies by Herman Hosker. I had to give mine to Jack Moorman. I bought it for 50 quid and I couldn't read it. It was full of Syriac and Latin and German and French, not to mention English. And I really struggled with that. So I gave it to Jack Moorman and I think he had no problem. But ordinary folks don't read that kind of stuff. Ordinary folks don't read Greek and Hebrew. Spurgeon had neither a university or a college training of any description, and he was not a graduate of any seminary, and he was probably one of the greatest preachers this country's ever produced. Arthur Pink, also says, in proportion as the churches have made an idol of education and theological learning in their ministers, has their spirituality waned. That's a fact, however unpalatable it may be. My favourite preacher, the late Herbert Roche, a preacher from Ohio, put it beautifully and simply when preaching on John 21. He said the single most important qualification for ministering to the Lord's sheep is a deep personal love for the Lord Jesus Christ. Compared to that, friends, a university education comes a long second if it shows up at all when it comes to the things of God. So my aim today is to minister as simply as I can to you whom I believe to be the Lord's sheep. So the aim, to repeat, to debunk the modern claim that modern Bibles are translated from more reliable documents than was the King James Bible, because they say the more reliable documents are the oldest and the best. And I'm going to divide the address into three basic questions. The first one is, how and by whom did this claim originate? Pages are stuck together. The second one, what materials are available by which to validate or invalidate the claim? And finally, what are the arguments for and against the claim? The claim, let me remind you, is that modern Bibles are based on more reliable manuscripts because they are the oldest and the best. The claim is that the King James Bible was translated from later and inferior manuscripts. So that's the claim we're seeking to address here. So the first question we're asking is, how and by whom did this claim originate? Well, it was two Cambridge scholars. Most of you will have heard of Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton John Hort, and they were the principal, or at least the most effective and persuasive promoters of the claim. Here they are, Mr. Westcott on the left and Mr. Hort on the right. And these were the guys that really pushed the whole idea that's really so much of what's going on in modern Bibles has originated, or at least been promoted greatly by these two. There were others before them, but these were the real promoters. These two men, especially Hort, were the most responsible also for the church drifting away from the King James Bible over time. So we're going to address their claims and theory because they are still, after 135 years, chiefly responsible for the significant departures from the King James Bible which appeared in modern Bibles. In his book, which I have downstairs, Early Manuscripts, Church Fathers and the Authorised Version, Jack Moorman confirms this and states at page 31, the standard text, which is what they call the modern text, is nearly as bound to Aleph and B, and I'll explain Aleph and B if you don't know what they are later, as the one drafted by Westcott and Hort over 100 years ago. Aleph and B are the two major so-called oldest and best manuscripts, and what Jack is saying here is that the modern Bible text is as much bound to Aleph and B as it was when Westcott and Hort drafted it over 100 years ago. So if we're dealing with the theory of Westcott and Hort, we're still dealing with much of what's going on today. The Greek and English texts of Westcott and Hort were thoroughly exposed and debunked within 12 months of their work appearing by an Anglican minister, the Dean of Chichester, John William Bergen, in 3 articles published in the Anglican Church's Quarterly Review, subsequently published together in a book called The Revision Revised. That's also available downstairs. Westcott was born in 1825 and was educated in Birmingham, sad to say, where I come from. He earned his degrees at Trinity College, Cambridge, and from 1890 until his death in 1901 was the Anglican Bishop of Durham. There's a great deal in his writings and associations to more than suggest that he was a lost man. There's a book downstairs again, A Testimony Founded Forever by James Seitler, and it gives a great deal of historical data concerning the life, the theology, the influences of Westcott, and makes for pretty shocking reading. So subtle was Westcott's heresy that even Charles Spurgeon highly recommended Westcott's introduction to the study of the Gospels. He was a subtle man, and he taught heresy, and sadly it was so cleverly done that even Spurgeon recommended his works. Westcott's collaborator in the effort to overthrow the text of the King James Bible was Fenton John Anthony Hort. Hort was born in Dublin in 1825 and met and became friendly with Westcott at Trinity College, Cambridge. The Church of England decided to amend what they called, quote, plain and clear errors in the text of the Authorised Bible, but Westcott and Hort, being on the translation committee, railroaded the whole proceeding. They disregarded the rules they were supposed to operate under from the Church of England and secretly provided all the committee members with their own new Greek text based upon the supposed oldest and best manuscripts. To use Jack Mormont's language, Hort had a preconceived malice toward the Greek text which underlines our King James Bible. Here's what Hort wrote to a friend in 1851 when Hort was just 23. I had no idea till the last few weeks of the importance of texts, having read so little Greek Testament, and dragged on with the villainous Textus Receptus. That's the Greek upon which our King James Bible is translated. He calls it villainous. Think of that vile Textus Receptus, leaning entirely on late manuscripts. It's a blessing there are such early ones. So, you know, they say today it doesn't matter which Bible you use. The guy that really started the fire, that really began the trouble, says that the Bible that we use is based on a vile text. And he's had his way largely, and it's going right through the churches. So the answer to our first question, how and by whom did this claim originate? Largely by Westcott and Hort. The second question, what materials are available by which to validate or invalidate the claim? Well, there's three main sources of data which have been used to establish the true text of the New Testament. And we'll be looking at these quite a bit today, this morning, more so this afternoon. The three main sources of data that are used to determine the text of the New Testament are Greek manuscripts. There's two sorts, uncials, which are large print, I'll tell you more about that, and then more running hand, lower print, cursives and lectionaries. The uncials tend to be earlier, 4th to the 10th century, the cursives are 9th to 16th. The other source for checking the text is versions, that's manuscripts of translations from the Greek into other languages, Latin, Syriac, Coptic. And notice how early these are as well. These versions were made well before Aleph and B. 200 years before these versions. And then also church fathers, the writings and commentaries of famous church leaders from the earliest and later periods of church history and from many geographical locations. These also are naturally in a wide variety of languages. So that's the second question, what materials are available? And the third question, which is going to take pretty much most of our time, is what are the arguments then using these materials for and against the claim? Let me repeat, the claim of modern Bible translators is the same generally of Westcott and Hort, that the King James Bible translators use late and inferior manuscripts. They claim that the discovery of the so-called oldest and best manuscripts in the mid-1800s has proven what is called the Textus Receptus to be inaccurate and thus unreliable. I shall be referring to the Textus Receptus throughout the presentation this morning and again this afternoon, and it's the name given for the numerically preponderant Greek New Testaments from which our authorised version of 1611 was translated. We shall be examining the theory of Westcott and Hort, by which they sought to dethrone the King James Bible. Many elements of the Westcott and Hort theory have actually been abandoned during the last 100 years by even their own followers, but their corrupted text still continues to be used. An analysis of some of the key pillars then of Westcott and Hort for changing the manuscript basis will probably be our best way forward today, this morning. And I'm going to lean again, as I say, largely upon the work of Dean John Bergen for the statement of the Westcott and Hort case and its rebuttal. It may be there will be little new material added to the debate today, but most new university or Bible college undergraduates are still being taught the same 100-year-old coswallop. One wonders how many of these university and Bible college graduates have ever even heard the names of Dean Bergen or E.F. Hills or Jack Mormon, or if they did, whether they were given a fair reading. One of the things that really galvanised me and prompted me to do this study this morning, I just happened, like you often do, I was on YouTube looking at something. You know what it is like when you're on YouTube, you've got these little pictures down the side. If you're not careful, just check that out. And I'll just check that out. You've got to watch where you go, haven't you? I'll just check that out. And I haven't been able to find it since, but I came across a young woman who was a university student, and I guess she was an undergrad, and she'd done this YouTube presentation, and she was mocking the idea of the King James being accurate, and she was coming out with all this stuff that we're hoping to deal with this morning. And I thought to myself, they are still being taught this Westcott and Hort junk in the universities, and they are. And they're still being taught it in the Bible colleges. And, as I think Jack pointed out to us last year, that's where the trouble really begins. You get the folks in Bible college, you teach them lies about text, and then you put them in pastors of churches, and it goes out. And Jack pointed this out at our seminar last year. Eventually, it starts to reach the ordinary people, and they are turned away from the old book. So, point by point now, we're going to look at the key elements of the Westcott and Hort theory, by which they sought to dispose of the Textus Receptus in the KJV. Now, I've listed the principal arguments under 6 headings. Don't worry if some of these words are new. Leah was asking me what conflation was. It's not your balloon going down, anything like that. We'll describe all these terms as we go, okay? And the first thing we're going to look at is the age of manuscript, because this is the key fact that they keep bringing up. They always talk about oldest and best. So let's look at age, first of all. There's an account in the Bible, in the book of Joshua, which seems to me to present a picture of the arguments presented by modern translators. And it's found in Joshua chapter 9. You'll see why we've got mouldy bread on here just now. It's found in chapter 9 of Joshua, beginning at verse 3. You can either follow it here, or if you've got your Bible in your lap, you can have a look at Joshua 9:3. It says that when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai, they did work wilily and went and made as if they had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon their asses and wine bottles, old and rent and bound up, and old shoes and planted upon their feet, and old garments upon them. And all the bread of their provision was dry and mouldy. And they went to Joshua into the camp of Gilgal, and said unto him and to the men of Israel, We be come from a far country. Now therefore make ye a league with us. And Joshua said unto them, Who are ye, and from whence come ye? And they said unto him, From a very far country thy servants are come, because of the name of the Lord thy God. Wherefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spake to us, saying, Take victuals with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say unto them, We are your servants. Therefore now make ye a league with us. This our bread we took hot for our provision out of our houses on the day we came forth to go unto you, but now behold, it is dry and mouldy. This is relevant because the Greek text of Westcott and Hort was mouldy bread from day one. Modern scholarship wants you to believe that it was once fresh bread, but it was always mouldy bread. The church rejected it as mouldy when it first appeared back in the earliest centuries. The Gibeonites pretended they were ambassadors from a very far country. You know Joshua and the Israelites were sent in to destroy the nations of Canaan. The Gibeonites were afraid. So they said, they were implying, we're not Canaanites, we've come a long way. And they actually left with all this mouldy bread to try and prove that they had come a long way. And as I say, the Gibeonites pretended they were ambassadors from a very far country. Now in the New Testament, you read about the far country. The far country is heaven. Westcott and Hort and their modern followers want you to think that they too are ambassadors with a message from heaven, but they're not. Next up in the Joshua account, in chapter 9, we read of Joshua's error, and the men took of their victuals, and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord, and Joshua made peace with them, and made a league with them. Many Christians, like Joshua, have not asked counsel at the mouth of the Lord with regard to this so-called bread. They are at peace with modern Bibles, and I maintain that if you will ask counsel at the mouth of the Lord, he will show you that the text of modern Bibles are mouldy and have always been so.
That's right.
Certain manuscripts, catalogued, we mentioned these already as Aleph and B, are older than the vast bulk of manuscripts which underline the King James Version. These two manuscripts are called uncials because they are large print. The word uncial, I'm told, is Latin for an inch. Manuscripts Aleph and B were the first and last word for Westcott and Hort. And here's an example from their theory of their opinion regarding Aleph and B. This is Westcott and Hort now. I took the quote out of Bergen's book, but I think it is reliable. And you can actually get this Westcott and Hort book. It's available to download, at least to look at on the internet. They said this: accordingly, it is our belief, one, that the readings of Aleph and B, I put Aleph in brackets because I couldn't find the Hebrew character on my laptop, so religion's in brackets because I put Aleph instead of the Hebrew character. Accordingly, it's our belief, one, that the readings of Aleph and B should be accepted as the true readings until strong internal evidence is found to the contrary. We'll talk about internal evidence this afternoon. And two, that no readings of Aleph or B can be safely rejected. Absolutely. Now these two manuscripts, Aleph and B, are also called Codex Sinaiticus. When they began to put them in book form, they were called Codex, and the plural is Codices. So Aleph is called Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus is Codex B. Now, Sinaiticus was discovered by a man named Constantine Tischendorf in the monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai in 1844. The document was found among other manuscripts in a waste paper basket awaiting to be burned by the monks. And if you have the inclination and you want to dig a little deeper, Tischendorf's own account of his discovery is on our Hellier Street website. Codex B, the other one, is also called Codex Vaticanus, and it seems to be brought into the Vatican Library shortly after its establishment by Pope Nicholas V in 1448, but nothing is known of its previous history. It's entered into the earliest catalogue of that library made in 1475. Aleph and B, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, are believed to be dated without contradiction, as far as I'm aware, from around 350 AD. They're both uncial manuscripts, in capitals if you like, and uncial manuscripts are usually, as I mentioned earlier, dated from the 4th to the 10th centuries, after which they begin to be replaced by lowercase manuscripts called cursives or minuscules. So Aleph and B are thought to be the oldest of the uncials, and it's these two which are chiefly referred to most of the time in modern Bible footnotes when they refer to the oldest and the best. And I've got some illustrations of what they look like. Paul Denny has kindly done these pictures for me. This is, it's not very clear I guess the text, but this is Vaticanus. It's a 3-column manuscript which you'll see this afternoon why column 3 is missing. But this is Vaticanus on the left, and that there is the last page of Mark's Gospel in Codex Sinaiticus. What the writers used to do was when they came to the end of a book, they would start a new column. So this is the end of Mark, which finishes incidentally in Aleph, as we shall see later, at chapter 8. And so it just starts the next Gospel at the top of the following column. So that's a 4-column manuscript. This is a 3-column manuscript. And yeah, the old manuscript, sometimes you've got maybe an interlinear, sometimes you'll have Greek on one page, Latin on the other, sometimes 3 columns, sometimes 4, sometimes 1. But this is just a glimpse. You remember Jack last year showing us some printouts. Those were Aleph and B that we see here. Some Bible translators, modern Bible translators, say that the age of these manuscripts is not their principal argument, that it's only one of many. But the argument is nevertheless used. Otherwise, why keep referring to them as the oldest in the modern Bible footnotes? I looked at one website, Codex Sinaiticus Project, and they have this to say about Aleph. Codex Sinaiticus, a manuscript of the Christian Bible written in the middle of the 4th century, contains the earliest complete copy of the Christian New Testament. That's always the last word for so many of the modern scholars, how early it is. Now, Tischendorf discovered Sinaiticus, as we mentioned, in 1844. He went back later on in 1859. And he wrote this in his historic account of the discovery after he found the second portion in 1859. This is from Tischendorf's own account of the discovery of the manuscript in 1859. Full of joy, which this time I had the self-command to conceal from the steward. This is in the monastery at St. Catherine's in Sinai. I had the self-command to conceal from the steward and the rest of the community. I asked, as if in a careless way, for permission to take the manuscript into my sleeping chamber to look over it more at my leisure. There by myself I could give way to the transport of joy which I felt. I knew that I held in my hand the most precious biblical treasure in existence. That's my emphasis there. A document whose age and importance exceeded that of all the manuscripts which I had ever examined during 20 years' study of the subject. I cannot now, I confess, recall all the emotions which I felt in that exciting moment with such a diamond in my possession. Now, 2 things strike me as I read this account by Tischendorf. First, he speaks of great joy, but none of any words of praise to God. I think that's an interesting omission. You don't find any praise to God in this account. Tischendorf was clearly of the mind also that God has left his church without inspired scriptures until he had the fortune to discover them, to rescue them from a fire in a Roman Catholic monastery, of all places. It's also perfectly clear that it was the age of the manuscript that turned his brains. Bergen quotes Frederick Scrivener, and I shall mention Frederick Scrivener a few times today. Bergen quotes Scrivener concerning Tischendorf. It's been ascertained that his discovery of Codex Aleph Sinaiticus caused his 8th edition, that's his printed Greek Testament, to differ from his 7th in no less than 3,505 places. And Scrivener comments to the scandal of the science of comparative criticism, as well as to his own grave discredit or discernment and consistency. To what degree, we must ask then, is the antiquity of a manuscript decisive as to its purity? Is there anything in the Bible, is there anything in the King James Bible to help us on this subject of the age of manuscripts? Well, there's this we looked at this last year, 2 Corinthians 2:17. Paul writes to the church of Corinth, "We are not as many which corrupt the word of God." And I pointed out last year, and it's often pointed out, that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth around about 60 AD, give or take a few years. Clearly, Bible corrupting was taking place as early as that. This is 300 years before Aleph and B. Paul wrote also to the church at Thessalonica, that ye be not soon shaken in mind, nor be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. This text also makes it clear that there were some who were contemporaries of Paul, who were forging his letters in the 1st century. It's clear, therefore, that antiquity alone is no guarantee of the purity of the text. Aleph and B, judged solely on their age, may still have been corrupted copies. D. Bergen, Westcott and Hort's most powerful critic, was allowed some time at the Vatican to study Codex B for himself, and his estimation of the worth of those manuscripts is somewhat different. This is Bergen. We venture to assure him, that's Bishop Ellicott, without a particle of hesitation, that Aleph, B and D are 3 of the most scandalously corrupt copies extant that's available. Exhibit the most shamefully mutilated texts which are anywhere to be met with, and have become, by whatever process, for their history is wholly unknown, the depositories of the largest amount of fabricated readings, ancient blunders, and intentional perversions of truth, which are discoverable in any known copies of the Word of God. You can see why Bergen didn't have a lot of time for the work of Westcott and Hort. Again, regarding the age of these 2 much idolised manuscripts, the point has been made repeatedly since the days of Bergen that the most likely reason for the survival of these manuscripts was the fact that they were not used. Bibles that I read get worn out. I've gone through several. I've been saved 40 years. I've gone through 3 or 4. We used to have a guy come to preach to us at Bethany, and his Bible, he was a great preacher, a wonderful man of God, but his Bible was falling apart. Some say the sign of a clean life is a dirty Bible. But of course, you might have just bought a new one, so don't get spying on one another. Now, E.F. Hills, who's a great defender of the King James Bible, and Jack Mormon and many others have stated that God's way of preserving the Holy Scriptures was by the continual usage of the church throughout the centuries. The modern idea that God preserved his word, buried in the sands of Egypt, means that he kept it from the church from 350 AD until Tischendorf at Westcott and Hort rediscovered it in the 18th century, the 19th century. By the modern hypothesis then, the church used inaccurate copies of the scriptures for 1500 years. The idea is ridiculous. Finally, Frederick Scrivener, on this heading, Frederick Scrivener was contemporary with Westcott and Hort. He was on the same translation committee as Westcott and Hort, which produced the revised version of 1881. Scrivener, however, was Hort's chief opponent in the translation committee, but was constantly outvoted. Bergen claimed that Frederick Scrivener was the most capable textual scholar of the day. And here's what Scrivener had to say about the earliest manuscripts. And this, Bergen says this ought to be famous, and it's a truth that stayed with me. It's no less true to fact, says Scrivener, than paradoxical in saying that the worst corruptions to which the New Testament has ever been subjected originated with 100 years after it was composed. That Irenaeus, AD 150, and the African fathers, and the whole Western with a portion of the Syrian church, used far inferior manuscripts to those employed by Stonecker or Erasmus or Stephens 13 centuries later when moulding the Textus Receptus. That's a very interesting observation. In short, Scrivener has just said that the younger, not the older manuscripts are the more trustworthy, because over time the church sifted out the errors, just as over time the church determined the canon. So they determined over time what was the true text. So after the church, after 1500 years, was conned by Westcott and Hort into reviving a rotten text that her forefathers had rejected. And Bergen quotes the relevant biblical text here. This is what happened. But it has happened unto them according to the true proverb, the dog is turned to his own vomit again, and the sow that was washed to a wallowing in the mire. It's not very often, when Bergen writes, and I love Bergen, I mean, we mentioned Bergen a lot today, but when Bergen writes, he's often dealing with Greek and so forth, and for a lot of folks that's difficult to follow, understandably. But very often when he quotes the scripture, it's absolutely bang on, and this is a real excellent assessment from the scriptures of what took place in the 19th century. The church returned like a dog to its vomit that was once washed from all this years ago. Now another element, we're moving on to the Westcott and Hort theory by which they sought to dispose of the Textus Receptus in the King James Bible, was what they called text types. One of the great hurdles that the 19th century critics of our Bible, the Textus Receptus, had to get over was the evident massive numerical superiority of manuscripts which favoured it above their preferred oldest and best. Not to worry, Westcott and Hort were on hand to cobble a theory which would suit their purpose. Before we look more closely at this part of their theory, it would be helpful to look at the numbers, variety of manuscripts that are available in total today, including the so-called oldest and best. And I'm quoting selectively but carefully from Jack Mormon's article, which you have, or you had last year, and if you want another one, I've got plenty here. Okay, quoting from Jack, this is what he has to say. The Liberal Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Munster, Germany, maintains the international recording list for Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. All manuscripts found anywhere in the world are recorded and examined by them. As of August 2009, the Institute gave what they called the nominal figures for the total number of known manuscripts. Papyri, that's on papyrus, they tend to be the oldest, 124. Uncials, that's large Greek manuscripts in Greek, 280. Minuscules, that's lowercase in Greek, 2,808. Lectionaries, 2,343. So the total figures that Jack gives in his book, which you've got, is 5,555. Now the great problem created by these manuscripts is that they overwhelmingly support the Textus Receptus, our King James Bible. So again, Jack says, the Alexandrian manuscripts, Codex B and its allies, that's my note there, comprise only a small fraction of the total number of manuscripts discovered, and there is wide variation among the few that do exist. These two facts place them in stark contrast to the great mass of cohesive manuscripts comprising the received text. Among manuscripts of reasonable length, we are probably being too generous in allowing them to claim as many as 40 manuscripts for the Alexandrian side. 40 would be less than 1% of the total number of manuscripts, now about 5,555. So how was this problem going to be addressed then by the 19th century critics? And one of the answers was text types. What Westcott and Hort did was to claim that manuscripts could all be categorised into distinct groups by a comparison of their common idiosyncrasies. To put matters very simply, if a number of manuscripts all omitted the same words in a particular number of passages, they were assumed to belong to a particular family, or text type as they called it. Westcott and Hort dogmatically asserted that there were 4 text types, which they called Western, Alexandrian, Neutral and Syrian. Don't worry about remembering all this stuff. If you just get some of the nitty-gritty, some of the meat out of this, that'll help you. Don't worry about the details too much. Now, Syrian was the name they gave to the vast number of manuscripts which underline our King James Bible, also called the Textus Receptus. And that is also referred to as Byzantine. Now, Andrew J. Brown, who was at one time on the committee, I think he was the secretary or the treasurer of the Trinitarian Bible Society, gives a clear description of what I would consider to be the text type scan in his little document, a review of D.A. Carson's The King James Version Debate, 1979. So I'm going to quote Andrew Brown now, commenting on Don Carson. And just in passing, before I give you the quote from Andrew Brown, I'll just mention that Don Carson is a promoter of modern Bibles. He has access to universities. As far as I'm concerned, a major troublemaker in this respect. Maybe a man of God, never met him, wouldn't know, but in this respect, he's a major troublemaker. When I did my first presentation of this subject many years ago, 25 years ago I guess, I was told by a church elder whom I invited something to this effect: why would you expect anyone to come and hear you when Don Carson has spoken? That's pretty much what he told me, and kind of said down the phone, don't expect me to come. And that's exactly the kind of dismissal without facts that I was referring to earlier on. Don Carson goes to universities, he's a professor maybe, or he's got a doctorate, and for most people that's enough. That elder didn't come, the elder that spoke to me on the phone didn't come, nor any of the other elders that I invited. But nevertheless, here's what Andrew Brown says, responding to Carson regarding text types in 1979. Under the current system of classification, a separate text type is assigned to any group of manuscripts which agree on a certain number of readings, no matter how corrupt they happen to be, and no matter how few the manuscripts. On the same principle, a large group of manuscripts which are broadly similar to one another because they all faithfully preserve the original text would have to be assigned to just one text type, even though, says Brown, they heavily outnumber the manuscripts from all other text types put together. If the author's expedient of counting up the text types is used, the result is obviously heavily biased in favour of the combined testimony of small groups of corrupt manuscripts and against a single large group of relatively pure manuscripts. Westcott and Hort have several so-called proofs in their bag of tricks for this notion of text types, which we address separately as we go. At this point, suffice to say that Bergen, who responded to their theory immediately, and others much more recently have declared it fanciful. Bergen went much further and expressed something like disgust with regard to this, but saying of their theory in general, we never before met with such a singular tissue of magisterial statements unsupported by a particle of rational evidence as we meet with here. And Bergen again, I love this, Bergen again says, may a plain man, sincerely in search of truth, after wasting many precious hours over these barren pages, he's talking about Westcott and Hort's book now, be permitted to declare that he resents such solemn trifling. And with specific reference to the Westcott and Hort claim about text types, Bergen says at page 108, Dr. Hort announced that for convenience he should henceforth speak of certain groups of documents by the conventional names Western, Pre-Syrian, Alexandrian and so forth. Accordingly, ever since, says Bergen, sometimes 8 or 10 times in the course of a single page, we have encountered this arbitrary terminology, have been required to accept it as the expression of ascertained facts in textual science. Others more recently, that is more than 100 years after Bergen, have come to the same conclusion that the text type notion is a stretch. For example, the late Kurt Allen, who is absolutely no friend at all to the Greek text, wrote this, to our text wrote this. We spoke of recensions, that's revisions, and text types, and if this was not enough, we referred to Pre-Syrian, Pre-Caesarean and other text types, to mixed texts, and so on. I too have spoken of mixed texts of the New Testament text in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but I've always done so with a guilty conscience. This was the guy that used to be in charge of the Munster place that we mentioned, that Jack mentioned earlier on, in Germany. Now wait a minute, here's a man, Kurt Allen, he's dead now, singularly responsible for the text of modern Bibles, saying that he has spoken of New Testament manuscript text types repeatedly with a guilty conscience. You wonder why he didn't repent of it. Maybe he did, and we just weren't told. In our day, the issue has come down to what may perhaps generally be called two text types. That which Hort called Alexandrian, as exemplified in Aleph and V, and what Hort called Syrian, which is the text of the great majority of manuscripts which underline our King James Bible. So we have two geographical regions then, which have produced conflicting texts. If you read Jack Moorman's handouts, which you've been given, or you got from last year, you will have evidence in abundance of the differences. I'm not dealing in detail today with the differences between modern Bibles and the King James Bible. We're going to look at two major instances this afternoon, and we are going to make comparison. But there's a whole list of them in that handout you've had this morning. And as I say, if you want another one, you're welcome. Jack gives all the details there. So we have two geographical regions which have produced conflicting texts. Read Jack Mormon's handout, as I say, and you'll see the differences. Now, does the Bible itself testify to one side or the other? Remember, when we're talking about the Syrian, what Hort called the Syrian, we're talking about the Textus Receptus. When we're talking about Alexandrian, we're talking about the Aleph and B type text, the minority text, if you will. So, what does the Bible say anything about Syria and Alexandria? In the book of Acts, chapter 11, verse 26, we read, the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. And where was Antioch? Well, it was in Syria. The church where the Apostle Paul and Barnabas worshipped and ministered, and where they were sent out together on their first missionary journey. So we have a biblical testimony with regard to Syria. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, ministered for a while at Antioch in Syria. It's reasonably likely that a Syrian text would have a high claim to purity. Furthermore, where was Alexandria, from where the Westcott and Hort text derives? What is the capital city of Egypt? What does the Bible have to say about Egypt? It was the place where Abraham and later the nation of Israel went in unbelief. It was the place where the Israelites were persecuted and murdered by Pharaoh in the days of Moses. In the light simply of biblical testimony, who would choose Egyptian manuscripts over Syria? But there is mention not only of Egypt but also of Alexandria in the Bible. Not just Egypt, but the capital of Egypt, Alexandria, mentioned in the Bible. Here's one of the mentions in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 6, then there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertines, and Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and them of Cilicia and Asia, disputing with Stephen. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit which he spake. Then they suborned men which said, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. Notice we've got the Alexandrians in here. Okay? This is just the first of 4 references to Alexandria in the Bible. And we read of Alexandrians, among others, whose complaints against Stephen resulted in his being stoned to death. Furthermore, we're told something about the ship in which Paul was shipwrecked off the island of Melita. I pressed the wrong button. Help. We're told about the ship in which Paul was shipwrecked off the island of Melita in Acts chapter 27. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy. Ship from Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. The prophetic church at the present time is making shipwreck of itself, which might well be the prophetic interpretation of the closing 2 chapters of Acts. She has climbed on board a ship from Alexandria, which also seems strangely bound for Italy. That's where Rome is, of course. Now, if you want to read more along this line, it's very interesting. I would recommend Given by Inspiration by Bill Gradley, which I have downstairs. He has a lot to say about Alexandria, very interesting and very biblical in my view. And a little booklet called The Tale of 3 Cities by the late David Reagan. So we've thought about age, we've thought about text types. Another thing that Westcott and Hort used was called genealogy. They claimed that all the manuscripts have lines of transmission which may be likened to a family tree. Again, if the genealogy is traced, the numbers of manuscripts may be reduced again to just a few paired copies, which may be compared on their merits without regard to numbers. This was the way they whittled the numbers testimony down. Jack Mormon gives a simple description of the argument in his book, which you've got missing in modern Bibles, and why it was unsatisfactory. First, he gives Westcott and Hort's argument for genealogy. The numerical preponderance of the received text can be explained by the study of the genealogical descent of its manuscripts. If, for example, of 10 manuscripts, 9 agree against 1, but the 9 have a common original, the numerical advantage counts for nothing. It's merely 1 to 1. So that's the genealogical argument. But Jack Mormon continues. This was the classic argument Westcott and Hort used to deny the received text any preference on the basis of numbers. The argument implies that many of the received text manuscripts are but copies of each other or of mere ancestors. But note, this is important, Westcott and Hort merely theorised on this. They did not present actual data of parent-to-child and ancestral relationship between manuscripts. Research since Westcott and Hort has shown that the great mass of received text manuscripts are not mimeographed copies, Very few have parent-child relationships. Instead, they are individual representatives of lines of transmission that go deep into the past. So Westcott and Hort talked about this genealogical tree and sort of, what's the word? Were very dogmatic about this, but they had no proof, they gave no facts at all, and this is what Jack's pointing out here. John Bergen, addressing their theory, directly said the same thing in 1881. High time, however, it is to declare that in strictness all this talk about genealogical evidence when applied to manuscripts is moonshine, Alan Bergen. Is moonshine. The expression is metaphorical and assumes that it has fared with manuscripts as it fares with the successive generations of a family. And so, to a remarkable extent, no doubt it has. But then it happens, unfortunately, that we are unacquainted with one single instance of a known manuscript coming from another known manuscript. And perforce all talk about genealogical evidence where no single step in the descent can be produced, in other words, where no genealogical evidence exists, is absurd. They ignored Bergen. Extraordinary, when you can understand why, can't you? Now, as the passing of 100 years from the production of Hort's genealogy theory subsequently produced new evidence proving incorrect after all, on the contrary, here's Wilbur Pickering, the book's downstairs. Other scholars have agreed that the genealogical method has never been applied to the New Testament. This is 1977. And they state further that it cannot be applied. Thus, Zott says it's inapplicable, Wagenaar says that it's useless, and Allen that it cannot be applied to the New Testament. Colwell also declares emphatically that it cannot be so applied. It might be helpful simply to point out to you that without clearly evident genealogical evidence, that is evidence demonstrated by comparing manuscripts to establish the genealogical tree, every manuscript must be received as an independent witness, and Westcott and Hort's problem with the preponderating text evidence remains. They posited the theory and backed it up with a great deal of assertion, but did not provide any facts. The churches fell for it then, and they're falling for it still. The sane, sober, analytical work of Bergen continues to go largely unheeded. Now, I don't know, we're hoping to get this on the internet. I don't know what kind of level of hits we'll have, but if it does some good to somebody in the university, then it's been a worthwhile enterprise. There were a few discernible relationships between manuscripts in Hort's day, but no evident parent-child copies were demonstrated according to Bergen. Furthermore, it had been stated by Tischendorf, the discoverer of Aleph and essentially a promoter of the Westcott and Hort text, that parts of Aleph and B were written by the same scribe. This fact points to a common original, and by Hort's own genealogical theory would make those two manuscripts only count as one. The next plank in the theory was what they called conflation. So they said, they dogmatically asserted that the manuscript displayed different text types, you remember, and they set out to show that the Syrian text, or the Textus Receptus, was a conflated text. We'll get to the word conflation. That is, that the earlier manuscripts which displayed shorter and supposedly more accurate texts, according to Westcott and Hort, had been combined by later scribes to create the Syrian text. That's why, you remember Jack saying to us last year, how many words was it? 8,000 letters? I can't quite remember. The equivalent of 1st and 2nd Peter is missing from modern Bibles. The AV text, there's more Greek text, if you like, underlying the AV, although the text of the modern Bibles is fuller because they're more worded. You remember that if you're here. So the earlier manuscripts displayed a shorter and supposedly, according to Westcott, more accurate text. And they've been combined by later scribes to create the Syrian text, which is what underlies our Bible. And that's why the modern critics claim that the King James Bible adds words. We say the modern translation take words away. The critics say, no, the King James Bible adds words. And it's on the basis of this idea of conflation. Whether the last 12 verses of Mark and the 12 verses we looked from John this afternoon fit into this mould, I can't say for sure. So when you pick up a modern Bible like the NIV, you find many words omitted that are found in the King James Bible. The footnotes will sometimes show the omitted words, but by footnoting them, the NIV translators are more than suggesting that those footnoted words are not inspired scripture. And what happens sometimes when the next edition comes out is the footnote disappears as well. So it's taken away slowly so you don't notice, like the old balling the front thing. First you put the text in the footnote, if you get a footnote at all. The next edition, and they keep bringing out new editions, will take the footnote away. And of course the young folks growing up, the older folks that grew up with the King James Bible, they're more inclined to spot the differences. But young folk going to Bible college, growing up, coming in the church, they're only hearing them on stuff. There's no alarm bells going off. They don't hear the differences. We spot them because we're familiar with the old book. There are also occasions when King James Bible words or text receptors words are dropped altogether and there's no footnote regarding the omission. I've done this, checked this out in my own NIV, which is 1979, and there are occasions where disputed verses are just taken out without a word. You don't know they're gone from the NIV. And in your handout of Jack Moorman's book, he states briefly the Westcott argument concerning conflation and gives a brief explanation. This is what conflation is. The combining of different text types, usually the Western and Alexandria, is the reason for the greater length of the traditional text, which is another name for the Textus Receptus. Rather than choose one or the other, both were used. This is the conflation argument. This is Westcott and Hort's argument. But Jack Moorman goes on to explain conflation. If a certain passage in one group of manuscripts reads Peter walked by the sea, but another John walked by the sea, the manuscripts which form the basis of the received text merely combine the two, Peter and John walked by the sea. This has been the standard explanation for the received text's greater length. But as it is now known, conflation cannot begin to account for this, and today textual scholars are reticent to appeal to it. Westcott and Hort, who were long on theory but short on demonstration, presented only 8 not very convincing examples of conflation. To make conflation the reason for the greater length of the KJV would require virtually thousands of clear instances. So let me repeat Westcott and Hort's appeal to conflation as the source of the Syrian text by the combination of older and manuscript more accurate text types. They proved with just 8 examples. They took 4 examples of conflation from Mark and 4 from Luke. And Bergen examined their claim with regard to these, and he's eager to hear what they have to say, and he says, let us, however, without more delay, be shown those specimens of conflation which in Dr. Hort's judgment supply the clearest evidence that Syrian are posterior alike to Western and to neutral readings. Of these, after 30 years of laborious research, Dr. Westcott and he, that's Dr. Hort, flatter themselves that they have succeeded in detecting 8. Remember that at this point in history, the 1880s, there were about 1,000 available Greek manuscripts. Now, to be fair, Westcott and Hort would not have access to them all. But can we wonder at Bergen's surprise that they can find only 8 examples of conflation? Where are the examples from Matthew and John? Not to mention the rest of the New Testament. Did they really expect the church to be convinced by such a tiny amount of evidence to alter the Textus Receptus in around 8,000 places, as Jack Moorman has shown in his book, by citing just 8 examples? Pickering makes this comment: to characterise a whole text for the whole New Testament on the basis of 8 examples is foolish. Bergen goes into some detail in his footnotes hereabouts to disprove their so-called conflation. Now his proofs involve some familiarity with Greek, so we'll take a simple one and anglicise it to illustrate. The Textus Receptus, our Bible, says this in Luke 24:53, and we're continuing in the temple, praising and blessing God. Amen. If you go to King James Bible, that's what it says. When Westcott and Hort produced this claim, out of 1,000 Greek manuscripts, only 5 disagreed with the Textus Receptus of this verse. And these 5 include what scholars since Westcott and Hort are always referring to as the oldest and the best. They were all uncial or capital manuscripts, and they are classified as Aleph, B, C, L and D. You'll hear more about C, L and D this afternoon, if you're still here. The first 4 exhibit only blessing. Remember the AV says they will continue in the temple praising and blessing God. The first 4 of those manuscripts exhibit only blessing without the words praising and manuscript D exhibits only praising without the words and blessing. So Westcott will classify the first 4 manuscripts as neutral text types and the 5th as a Western text type. Then they say that the Syrian text, our King James Bible, is a conflation of the two. That is, praising and blessing. That's conflation. That was their claim. So I'm not saying that they use this particular verse, I'm just using this verse to illustrate conflation. So here's the error in a nutshell. Westcott Hall simply asserts that the 5 older manuscripts exhibit a more primitive text, and that the Syrian text, the Textus Receptus, was produced later by combining them. But this is assertion and not proof. Is it not at least as likely that the Syrian text is the oldest and so-called Western and neutral have omitted the words? The age of the manuscripts in question is by no means conclusive, as we've already seen, because the Syrian text may well have older source manuscripts which are no longer in existence. But the likelihood that the 5 old manuscripts have actually omitted words increases with the familiarity of their overall content. Scrivener, whom Bergen held in high regard as a textual scholar, and whom I said earlier was Hord's chief opponent in the Revised Version Translation Committee, said this about Codex B, which shortens the text in Luke 24:53. This is Scrivener's comment on Codex B that shortened that text we just looked at. He says Codex B leaves out words or whole clauses no less than 330 times in Matthew, 365 in Mark, 439 in Luke, 357 in John, 384 in the Acts, 681 in the surviving epistles, or 2,556 times in all. This is omissions from Codex B. That no small proportion of these are mere oversights of the scribe seems evident from the circumstances that this same scribe has repeatedly written words and clauses twice over, which by no means enhances our estimate of the care employed in copying this venerable record of primitive Christianity. John Bergen also writes in the extraordinary volume of omissions from these 5 manuscripts called Western and Neutral. And for simplicity, we'll just quote what he had to say about Codex D, representing the so-called Western text, and in particular the last chapter of Luke, from which this praising and blessing example comes. This is what Bergen says. In the last chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, which consists of 837 words, no less than 121 are omitted by Codex D. To state the case differently, D is observed to leave out 1 word in 7 in the very chapter of St. Luke, which supplies the instance of conflation under review. You see what he's saying? There's 1 word in 7 is missing, and they're claiming that it's a more accurate text because certain words are missing. What possible significance, therefore, can be attached to its omission of the clause and blessing? And since the same remarks apply to the remaining cases, will any reader of ordinary fairness and intelligence be surprised to hear that we reject the assumed conflation unconditionally as a silly dream? So much for Westcott's theory concerning the age of manuscripts, the text types, the genealogy and the conflation. A couple more points and we'll have a break. Everything for time. A couple more points, we'll have a break. Westcott and Hort admitted that the Syrian text that underlies our King James Bible was predominant as early in history as 350 AD. Westcott and Hort wrote the fundamental text. I've jumped one. The fundamental text of late extant Greek manuscripts generally is beyond all question identical with the dominant Antiochian or Greco-Syrian text of the second half of the 4th century. What they're saying is the text of the body of the late text, as they like to call them, is identical with the text that was dominant in the second half of the 4th century. That's contemporary with Aleph and B. Bergen again writes of the extraordinary volume of missions. Sorry, I'm jumping back here. Let's get back to my notes again. Yeah, Westcott then admitted that the Syrian text type, which underlines our Bible, was predominant as early as 350. Well, how's that to be explained? If it was a later conflated text, how did it come to be predominant over the oldest and best manuscripts at the same time, as early as 350 AD? And again, fertile imagination came to the rescue with what they called official revision. Here was their excuse, here was their answer. The growing diversity and confusion of Greek texts led to an authoritative revision at Antioch, which was then taken as a standard for a similar authoritative revision of the Syriac text, and was itself at a later time subjected to a second authoritative revision, this final process of being apparently completed by AD 350 or whatever. So they're saying there were these manuscripts that have this Textus Receptus Syrian text. They were around at the same time as the text of Aleph and B. And the reason it's predominant is because all the church leaders got together and they decided to make it the official text. So, according to Westcott and Hort, as we saw under the heading conflation there, earlier Westcott, Alexandrian and neutral texts were combined to form the textual receptors. The next step in their theory was to claim that this was done by an official revision made by church leaders on 2 occasions between 250 and 350 AD. One revision of the Syriac version, another revision of the Greek. Jack Mormon points this out in the copy that you've got. That this conflating was officially carried out around the year 300. History has left not the slightest trace. Here they are again, putting a theory forward, making dogmatic statements about revision, and Jack Mormon says, and others before him, history has not left the slightest trace. This historical blank has led modern scholars to speak of the lengthening of the received text in terms of a process that occurred over a considerable time, possibly centuries. Yet how such a process, unnoticed by history, carried out by many scribes over centuries across a wide geographic area, could achieve the widespread uniformity so apparent in the received manuscripts is beyond imagination. And Bergen agrees as well. He writes, contemporary with Westcott and Hort, not a shadow of proof is forthcoming that any such recension or revision as Dr. Hort imagines ever took place at all. Now I'm going to skip some of this because time is going on. But here, I just got so excited when I read this because Bergen's answer here is just wonderful. This is what he says. A mighty army of forgotten bishops, fathers, doctors of the Nicene period come back and calmly assure the accomplished professor, that's Professor Hort, that the evidence on which he relies is but an insignificant fraction of the evidence which was before themselves when they delivered their judgment. Had you known but the 1,000th part of what we knew familiarly, say they, you would have spared yourself this exposure. Bergen saying, let's just suppose that revision really took place. He's then saying, all the doctors of the church got together according to your theory, Hort, and they have rejected your Bible. And they have manuscripts as old, and lots more manuscripts far older than the ones you claim. Which I think is a pretty powerful response. So with perhaps Aleph and B in their hands, the church leaders, and manuscripts like them, they condemn the so-called Alexandrian, Western and neutral texts by Hort's own hypothesis in favour of the Textus Receptus. And according to Hort, they did this twice at 2 separate conferences with both the Greek and the Syrian versions. I'm going to move forward because time's going. I shall leave a little bit of this out. I was going to mention scribal habits as the last point, and we've not really got time to go into all this, I think. I'm sure you get thirsty and a little bit peckish. So they had 2 rules. We won't go into all the details. There are 2 rules by which they would determine which texts, once they were examining the texts, which were more correct. One was the more difficult reading is to be preferred, and the other was the shorter reading is to be preferred. So we'll just look at these briefly. Scribal habits, those were the 2 rules they used and still use, I believe. The more difficult reading is to be preferred. When comparing one manuscript with another, and you're trying to decide which word is right and which word is wrong, they say the more difficult reading is to be preferred. This was what Westcott and Hort said, and others before them. And also the shorter reading is preferred. So let's look at, briefly and quickly as I can, the more difficult reading is to be preferred. This is what Pickering writes. The basis for this is an alleged propensity for scribes or copyists to simplify or change the text when they found a supposed difficulty or something they did not understand. Dag and I said of this canon, but the more difficult reading is not always the more probably authentic. The rule does not apply, for instance, in the case of some accidental errors. But what is worse, we sometimes find difficult or intricate readings that are the outcome of intentional corrections. A copyist, through misunderstanding some passage or through not taking the context into account, may in all sincerity make something obscure that he means to make plain. Now, not all anomalies in the text are due to deliberate falsification. Sometimes they're simply due to the carelessness of the copyist. Let me remind you of what Scrivener said earlier, that no small proportion of these are mere oversights of the scribe, talking about me, I think, seems evident from the circumstances that this same scribe has repeatedly written words and clauses twice over, which by no means enhances our estimates of the care employed in the copying this verbal recorded primitive Christianity. A careless scribe may not only omit words, he may misspell or duplicate words or phrases. I'll cut some of this out for time's sake. The difficult readings. Here's one striking instance where they didn't follow their own rule, and the reason for the departure seems pretty obvious. Let me just get down to this one quickly. And it came to pass, this is what our Bible says, it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. That's a difficult reading, you know. That puzzled the church fathers. What does that mean? The last 6 words in this place are the translation of just one or sometimes 2 words in Greek. The second Sabbath after the first. In the Greek, it's just 1 or 2 words. And Bergen mentioned 6 notable church fathers, including Chrysostom, who had difficulty understanding that Greek word. So it's a difficult reading, and one would expect that Westcott would prefer it to any rivals. But they do not. The NIV, which generally represents the changes adopted by Westcott, says this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going. So that difficulty had been taken out. Well, why didn't they keep by their rule? If it's a difficult reading, they should have left it in. But they took it out, because they can't understand it. The NIV, following Westcott and Hort, has chosen a simpler reading, and perhaps a clue to the departure from the rule can be found in the fact that Aleph and B and Sinaiticus both omit the difficult words. That's what we take, because Aleph and B haven't got it. And very quickly, the other maxim used was the shorter reading is to be preferred. And here is Hort's statement of this, as cited by Pickering. In the New Testament, as in almost all prose writings which have been much copied, corruptions by interpolation are many times more numerous than corruptions by omission. So saying it's much more likely that corruptions are going to come in by the addition of words. This is what they're saying, not by the omission. So writes Wilbur Pickering in his very interesting and useful book. Jack Mullen has this to say about this maxim. Another classic example of tailoring the clothes to fit Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. As with the other tenets of Westcott and Hort, it has no basis in fact. Regarding deliberate alteration, it is far easier to remove a word or passage and get away with it for a while. Like, for example, last 12 verses of Mark, 12 verses of John 8, than to add material. When there is no particular attempt to editorialise, constant copying will result in accidental omission far more often than accidental addition. The old manuscripts are full of omissions. So Westcott and Hort said, a scribe is more likely to add words than he is to omit them. Well, you could just try the exercise yourself. Copy a couple of pages of books out of a book and see how many words you add compared to how many you might leave out. In another excellent work by Bergen called The Causes of Corruption, he shows from many examples how corruptions came into the manuscripts. Among other causes, and I'll deal with this very briefly if I can, he gives examples of the causes of omission of words. And one of these is a big word you can take away today called homoiotoluton, which is just a fancy way of saying likeness of ending. And his simple description of what happens will serve that purpose. This is why, that's not the one, sorry. This is why words sometimes get left out, and I'm going to give you an example. The eye of a scribe, on reverting from his copy to the original before him, is of necessity apt sometimes to alight on the same word, or what looks like the same word, a little lower down. The consequence is obvious. All that should have come in between gets omitted, or sometimes duplicated. That's referred to as homoiotoluton. Now, Bergen's examples of this are all in Greek. So I'm going to try simplify it by giving an illustration in English. Now, this example may or may not occur in Greek manuscripts. I'm simply illustrating here how omissions are sometimes made. If you was to turn to Mark chapter 9, verses 44 through 47, this is what you'd read, where their worm dieth not and their fire is not quenched. And if thy foot offend thee, cut it off, it is better for thee to eat. Just, I chose this as an example. How many churches would pick this as an example? Tells you something about me, doesn't it? We're right in the fires of hell here. I met an old guy recently who I hadn't seen for a long, long time, an old friend we went to school together. And he was asking me, what's the church like and so on. I said, there's not many others because I'm a bit of a hellfire preacher. Well, here's the example. Here's the example I picked. Verse 45. And if thy foot offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter halt into life than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched. Where their worm dieth not and their fire is not quenched. And if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. It is better for thee to enter into the kingdom of God with 1 eye than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire. Now let's imagine that a scribe has been copying from a manuscript which reads like this. I'm going to give you an illustration of Untitled, okay? And he copies as far as the end of verse 44, where their worm died off and their fly is not quenched, and he puts his full stop. And in comes the abbot and says to him, "Cadfael, fetch me a cup of mead." So our scribe goes and does as he's told. When he returns to his desk and continues copying, he reads verse 44 in his copy, but mistakenly reads from verse 46 in the original, which is exactly the same, and carries on at verse 47, and thus leaves verse 45 out altogether. It's the moving of the eye. The great word that Bergen uses, oscitancy. Due to the scribe's oscitancy, he skips that. So you can see that's Untitled. That happens a lot in the manuscripts. Common sense tells us, without the need for endless examples, that it's much more likely that a scribe will omit words accidentally than he would make them up and insert them. If omissions are more likely than additions, then a manuscript noted for brevity of text suggests a more careless or indifferent scribe. Such a consideration makes the manuscript suspect. And I've quoted Bergen a great deal, and Bergen actually studied these manuscripts, went to the Vatican and other places, looked at these manuscripts. And I just love the work of Bergen because he's so careful. And his verdict was that these manuscripts, these oldest and best manuscripts, are unreliable. So let's briefly recap, just very briefly, we're coming to a close now, our 6 examinations of the reasons formerly used by Westcott North why so-called oldest and best manuscripts should correct the King James Version. The age, well, the Bible says that age is not by any means conclusive. Genealogy, no genealogical trees have ever been demonstrated, and people like Jack Mormon and Bergen have said that they can't be. Text types, again, same problem. It was just used to overthrow the majority text. Conflation, they gave only 8 examples out of 2 Gospels. They could have given many more. Official revision, no sign in history whatsoever of that ever happening. And the scribal habits, the harder reading is to prefer, the shorter reading is to prefer. Those things, I think, are just not true. I think it's fair to say that on every point, Westcott North evidence is both contrived and seriously at fault. The whole thing was created for no other purpose than to depose the Textus Receptus because Hort hated it, and replace it with the readings of his beloved Codex Vaticanus. The modern church is snoring so soundly that many Christians get really upset if we speak disparagingly of the Roman Catholic Church. Perhaps then we ought not to be surprised that the idolisation of Codex Vaticanus bears a striking resemblance to the centuries-old idolisation of the man who lives there, namely the Pope. Now this afternoon, Lord willing, we're going to look at some specific and serious changes to our Bible because of the so-called oldest and best manuscript. I hope you'll stay. I hope it hasn't been too much of an exercise on your brain until this morning. But we're going to look at 2 places this afternoon. And we're going to look at the evidence for the authenticity of the last 12 verses of Mark and the 12 verses dealing with a woman taken in adultery in John's Gospel. So thanks for your attention. We'll have a break for a little while. We're going to have some refreshments, I believe.